The night the headlights appeared outside Jake Walker's ranch, he thought the war had finally followed him home. The snow was falling hard, the Montana wind slicing through the valley when Ranger, his loyal German shepherd, began barking like he'd seen a ghost. Moments later, a man stepped out of a black SUV, shouting Grace's old name into the darkness. That voice, the one she'd spent years always running from, had found her again. But this time, she wasn't alone. Jake, a former Navy SEAL scarred by battles both foreign and personal, stood on the porch with the calm of a man who'd faced death before. And when the sheriff's lights finally cut through the storm, no one in that valley would ever forget what happened next. Because this wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about reclaiming peace, about proving that even the most broken souls can build a home again. If you believe that second chances still exist, comment Amen and tell us, where in the world are you watching from tonight? The wind that night carried the kind of cold that settled in your bones and stayed there. Outside Jake Walker's cabin, the world was silent. Montana's endless plains covered in snow, the moonlight turning everything a pale silver. Inside, the old wood stove hummed softly. A half-empty coffee mug sat on the table, untouched long enough for the surface to film over. Jake sat on the couch, his elbows resting on his knees, staring at the muted flicker of the television. He wasn't watching. Hadn't for years, really. The noise was there to fill the silence. Nothing more. His hair was dark, flecked with gray near the temples, the result of too many sleepless nights. A faint scar cut through the stubble along his jaw, a reminder of something he no longer talked about. His hands, broad and scarred, still bore the calluses of a man who never learned to live gently. On the floor beside him lay Ranger, his German shepherd. The dog was massive, almost 90 pounds of muscle and loyalty, his fur a thick coat of black and tan that glimmered under the firelight. Ranger was 6 years old, trained to respond to the sharp whistle of command, but these days needed none. He seemed to sense Jake's moods better than anyone ever had. The clock read 11:57 p.m. Jake was considering turning in when the phone rang. He froze. Hardly anyone called at this hour. His first instinct, habit formed during years of deployment, was to ignore it. But something in the persistent tone made him reach for the receiver. "Walker." His voice came out low, rough like gravel. "Mr. Walker? Sorry to call this late." The voice was female, calm but urgent. "This is Maggie Barnes, from the Horizon Shelter Network. You donated a few years back and allowed us to use the guest cabin on your property for emergency placement cases." Jake rubbed a hand across his face. He remembered. After coming back from Afghanistan, he'd signed some papers, given permission for the shelter to send someone in crisis to his land if needed. It had never actually happened. Until now. "I remember," he said quietly. "What's going on?" "There's a woman," Maggie continued. "Grace Miller, 28 years old. Domestic violence case. She's been through a lot. We relocated her from Boston, but we're running out of safe houses that aren't compromised. The file suggests she'd do better somewhere remote. We thought of you." Jake leaned back in his chair, eyes tracing the frost gathering at the window. "I'm not exactly the ideal host." Maggie gave a small, strained laugh. "You don't need to be. Just keep her safe for a while. She's been through multiple relocations. Every time her husband found her again. He's resourceful and dangerous. But she agreed to one last transfer. Montana." Jake was silent for a long moment. He looked down at Ranger, whose ears had perked up, eyes steady on him as if waiting for the decision. "How long?" Jake asked. "A few weeks, maybe a month, until we can arrange permanent housing." He sighed through his nose. The isolation he'd built around himself suddenly felt like a wall too high to climb back over. "All right," he said finally. "I'll pick her up." "Thank you, Mr. Walker. You're doing something good." He didn't respond. He hung up, looked at Ranger, and muttered, "Guess it's not just us anymore, buddy." The morning came gray and quiet. Jake loaded his old Chevy pickup, the kind that groaned each time he turned the key, and Ranger jumped in the back seat, sitting tall and alert. Snowflakes drifted lazily across the windshield as they made the drive toward Redwood Falls Regional Airport, a small, single-runway strip where few people ever came or left. When the plane arrived, only 5 passengers stepped off. 4 were dressed in business attire, moving fast toward waiting cars. The 5th lingered at the bottom of the steps, clutching a worn leather bag and a folder against her chest. Grace Miller looked like someone who hadn't slept in weeks. She was slender but tense, as if her body had forgotten how to rest. A long beige coat hung awkwardly on her frame, sleeves hiding her hands. Her dark blonde hair was tied back in a loose braid, and beneath the brim of her knit hat, Jake caught the faint discoloration along her jaw, a bruise fading from purple to yellow. She hesitated when she saw him, her eyes, gray-green and cautious, darting between Jake and the massive shepherd behind him. "Grace Miller?" he asked. She nodded once, voice barely above a whisper. "You're Jake Walker?" "Yeah, Maggie sent me." He held out a hand but didn't push when she only nodded again. "That your luggage?" She looked down at the single suitcase near her feet. "That's all I have." Jake picked it up, heavier than it looked. The handle was frayed, the corners scuffed, like it had been through more than a few hurried trips. Inside the truck, silence filled the air. Ranger leaned forward from the back seat, nose twitching. Grace stiffened, but the dog simply sniffed, then rested his head gently on her shoulder. Jake watched from the corner of his eye. He doesn't usually warm up to people that fast. Grace managed the faintest of smiles. "Maybe he can tell I'm tired of fighting." Jake glanced at her but didn't answer. The road stretched out ahead, long and white under the Montana sky. After a few miles, she spoke again, her voice trembling between exhaustion and formality. "They told me you might want to see this." She opened the folder and handed him a folded letter. It bore the Horizon Shelter letterhead and the familiar neat handwriting of Maggie Barnes. Jake parked briefly by the roadside, snow hissing under the tires, and read the note. "Mr. Walker, the woman you're meeting has endured significant trauma. Her situation is volatile, and her abuser remains under investigation. She's not just seeking refuge. She's seeking safety and the chance to breathe again. You have every right to decline hosting if you feel unsafe. But if you can, give her space and time. Thank you for your service, both past and present." Jake folded the paper, slid it back into the folder, and looked over at her. Grace's hands were clenched tightly in her lap. "Do you want me to drop you in town instead?" he asked quietly. Her eyes flicked toward him, wide with something between fear and hope. "Do you not want me there?" He shook his head slowly. "Wasn't what I meant." He paused, glanced back at Ranger. The dog was watching her still, unblinking, protective. "If Ranger's good with you, that's all the approval you need. You're safe with us." Grace turned toward the window, tears threatening but not falling. She whispered, "Thank you." Jake started the engine again. The tires crunched over frozen ground, and the truck rolled forward into the vast, white expanse. Neither spoke the rest of the drive. The silence wasn't awkward. It was fragile, as if both knew that words could break something delicate. Ranger shifted closer between them, his breathing steady, grounding the space with quiet assurance. By the time the pickup left the highway and turned down the narrow dirt road toward Jake's ranch, the last hint of daylight had faded. The headlights cut through the snow, revealing the outline of a small log cabin and a barn nearby, both half buried under frost. Jake parked in front of the porch, engine idling. "Welcome to nowhere," he said softly. Grace exhaled slowly, as if letting go of air she'd been holding for months. "Nowhere sounds perfect." He helped her with the suitcase, opened the door, and let Ranger jump out first. The shepherd circled once, sniffed the air, then sat facing the road, as if already standing guard. Inside, the warmth of the cabin wrapped around them. Smell of wood, coffee, and something faintly metallic, like memories Jake could never quite wash away. Grace stepped over the threshold, clutching her coat tighter, uncertain yet grateful. Jake hung his jacket, looked at her once more, and said quietly, "You're not alone now." Outside, the wind howled again, sweeping across the plains, erasing the tire tracks behind them as if to mark a clean start for three lost souls sharing one roof. The drive to Jake's ranch took another hour through a narrow, snow-covered road that cut through the pine woods. The sky had turned a dull, steel gray, and the wind whistled through the trees like something alive. Grace Miller sat quietly in the passenger seat, her hands folded over her lap, watching the world blur past her window. She hadn't said a word since they'd left the airport. Jake Walker, his hands steady on the wheel, kept his eyes on the road. His rugged face, half hidden beneath a day's stubble, was unreadable. The sharp angles of his jaw and the small scar cutting across his left eyebrow hinted at a life built on discipline and loss. He wasn't used to company, not anymore. Ranger sat in the back seat, his alert amber eyes shifting between Jake and Grace. Every bump in the road made his ears twitch. The dog was protective but calm, the kind of composure that came from years of training alongside soldiers. His thick coat shimmered between shades of black and tan, a perfect camouflage against the Montana wilderness. When the truck finally pulled up to the ranch, Grace's breath caught. The property stretched wide and quiet beneath a dusting of snow. The main cabin stood near a cluster of tall pines, smoke curling faintly from the chimney. Behind it was a smaller cabin, simple, weathered, but well kept. A wooden fence traced the outline of the barn, and a few chickens pecked lazily at the frozen ground. Jake turned off the engine. "That's the main house," he said, nodding toward the larger structure. "You'll stay there. The smaller cabin out back's used for tools and storage, but it's yours if you ever want privacy." Grace hesitated before stepping out. The cold bit through her coat, but she inhaled deeply. The air was cleaner than anything she'd breathed in months. Ranger jumped out first, landing in the snow with a soft thud. He gave a low bark and circled around Grace once before sitting down, watching her closely. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of pine and wood smoke. The floorboards creaked beneath their boots. The living room was small but warm, a stone fireplace taking up one wall, a worn leather couch facing it. The kitchen stood to the right, neat, organized, clearly maintained by someone who valued routine over comfort. Jake showed her the guest room. You'll have your own space. Bathroom's down the hall. Lock works fine. She nodded, fingers brushing the brass doorknob as if testing whether this kind of safety could be trusted. Kitchen's shared, he added. You eat what you want, when you want. There's coffee every morning around 6. I leave early to feed the animals, so you'll hear some noise around then. Okay. Her voice was quiet, barely audible. He paused at the doorway. I won't ask questions you don't want to answer. Same goes the other way. Deal? Grace met his eyes briefly, eyes as blue as the winter sky, but dulled by something old and heavy. Deal, she whispered. Days passed quietly. The first morning, Grace woke to the sound of Ranger pacing outside her door. When she stepped out, the dog wagged his tail once before following her into the kitchen. Jake had already left for the barn, leaving a mug of steaming coffee and a note on the counter. If you need anything, ask Ranger. He listens better than most people. She smiled for the first time in weeks. By afternoon, she ventured outside. Jake was splitting firewood, his breath visible in the icy air. His shoulders moved in steady rhythm, each swing of the axe precise. When he noticed her standing near the porch, he nodded but didn't speak. That was something she appreciated. His silence never felt hostile. Over the next few days, an unspoken rhythm formed. Grace cooked small dinners, soups, cornbread, stews, and Jake would eat them without comment but always washed the dishes afterward. She started mending curtains, organizing the pantry, and fixing the loose latch on the chicken coop. Each task gave her a reason to breathe again. Ranger became her shadow. He followed her to the barn, sat by her feet when she read, and slept in the hallway outside her room every night. Sometimes she woke from nightmares, drenched in sweat, heart pounding. When that happened, the dog would whine softly and rest his head on her knee until she steadied her breathing. Jake noticed, of course. He didn't mention it, but the next morning there was a flashlight and a thermos of chamomile tea left on the kitchen table. A week later, a storm rolled in from the north. The power flickered and died just after sunset. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, and snow slapped against the windows like a warning. Jake lit a few candles and added wood to the fire. Grace sat near the hearth, the light flickering across her face. Her bruises had begun to fade but were still visible, faint purple shadows along her cheek and temple. They sat in silence, the only sound the crackle of burning logs and Ranger's soft breathing. Finally, Grace spoke. You ever get scared, Jake? He looked up. Scared? I mean, so scared you wanted to disappear. Her voice trembled, but not from the cold. Jake stared into the fire for a long time before answering. Yeah. Afghanistan, 2014. We were ambushed outside Kandahar. Lost 2 good men. Thought I'd go with them. He swallowed hard, eyes distant. But fear's funny. It doesn't go away. It just gets quieter. Then one day, you realize you've been living with it so long, you wouldn't recognize yourself without it. Grace didn't say anything. She stared at the flames, her hands clenched in her lap. After a long silence, she reached up and unwound the scarf around her neck. Beneath it, the edge of an old bruise still lingered, yellow and green against her pale skin. Jake didn't flinch. He simply nodded once, a gesture that said, I see you without needing words. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, the firelight danced over their faces, one marked by war, the other by survival. And between them, Ranger lifted his head, watching both, as if to remind them they weren't alone in the dark. The next morning dawned bright and cold. Grace found Jake already outside repairing a loose gutter, his breath forming clouds in the air. She joined him with 2 mugs of coffee. "I can help," she offered. He raised an eyebrow. "You don't have to." "I know," she said simply, "but I want to." He handed her a wrench, and together they worked in quiet rhythm. For the first time in years, Jake didn't feel the weight of silence pressing down. Later that week, Grace began using his old laptop to look up farming schedules and crop rotation tips. The ranch's record book had been untouched for months, numbers scratched in Jake's cramped handwriting. She spent hours organizing it into neat columns. When she showed him, Jake studied the pages and gave a low whistle. "You might have just saved me a season's worth of trouble." Grace smiled faintly. "Guess I'll earn my keep after all." He didn't correct her, but that night, when he set an extra log in the fireplace before turning in, he realized something had changed. The cabin no longer echoed with emptiness. The air felt lighter, warmer. As snow continued to fall outside, the unlikely trio, 1 soldier, 1 survivor, and 1 loyal shepherd, settled into a fragile but growing sense of peace. The morning sun spilled across the valley, pale and cold, melting the frost that had gathered overnight. Jake Walker loaded the truck with feed supplies while Grace double-checked the list she had written neatly on a scrap of paper. Her handwriting was careful, almost hesitant, as if afraid of taking up too much space. "Town trips once a week," Jake said, tossing the last sack into the bed of the pickup. "You sure you're up for it?" Grace nodded. "I think it's time I saw something other than trees and chickens." He gave her a small, approving smile. Ranger jumped into the back seat, tail thumping lightly against the vinyl, his breath fogging up the window. The drive into Redwood Falls was quiet, punctuated by the occasional crunch of snow under the tires. Grace sat with her hands folded in her lap, eyes darting between the horizon and the rearview mirror, still haunted by the habit of checking for shadows that followed. Jake noticed, but didn't comment. The cafe stood on the corner of Main and Willow, a small brick building that smelled of roasted beans and cinnamon. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and strangers stood out like broken branches in the snow. As they stepped inside, conversations dimmed for half a beat. Grace felt the weight of curious eyes, the hush that follows unfamiliar faces. Jake ordered 2 coffees and a plate of pancakes. His low voice carried the calm authority of a man who rarely spoke, but when he did, people listened. Grace sat near the window, trying to ignore the murmurs. Ranger lay at her feet, head resting on his paws, amber eyes scanning the room. The dog's presence was both shield and spotlight. People stared at the massive shepherd, then at her. The bell over the door jingled, and in walked Deputy Maria Lopez. Maria was in her mid-30s, about 5'7", her dark hair tied back in a practical braid. Her uniform fit neatly, and her badge caught the morning light as she moved. She carried herself with a quiet confidence, shoulders squared, gaze alert, like someone who'd spent years balancing toughness with empathy. Jake noticed her instantly. They'd met before, once when she came to check on a noise complaint from the neighboring property. He'd been polite but brief, his tone clipped, his walls firmly up. Maria recognized him too. "Well, look who decided to rejoin civilization," she said lightly, her voice warm but probing. Jake gave a half smile. "Coffee run. Don't make it sound dramatic." Maria's eyes flicked to Grace, then to Ranger. "New friend?" "This is Grace Miller," Jake said. "She's staying out at the ranch for a while." Grace offered a polite smile. "Hi." Maria's gaze softened slightly, but her instincts didn't miss the faint bruise, yellowing now at the edge of Grace's collarbone. She didn't mention it. Instead, she said, "You've got good company, Jake. That shepherd looks like he runs the place." "He pretty much does." Jake took a sip of his coffee. Maria chatted a few minutes longer. Small talk about the weather, supply routes, the upcoming county fair. But Grace felt every second stretch. When the deputy left, the cafe seemed louder again. Jake paid the bill, and they drove home. Neither spoke much, but Grace could feel something shift in Jake's expression, an awareness that they'd caught someone's attention, even if unintentionally. 3 days later, near dusk, someone knocked on the cabin door. Ranger barked once, low and warning, before Jake opened it. Maria stood there, her patrol truck parked near the fence line, its lights flashing faintly in the falling snow. "Evening, Walker," she said. "Sorry to drop in unannounced. Routine security check for properties outside town limits." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Routine? You haven't done one of those since spring." Maria gave a small shrug. "New initiative. County wants us to be thorough." Her tone was even, but Jake could see something beneath it. Concern. "Mind if I step in for a minute?" she asked. He nodded, stepping aside. Grace appeared from the kitchen, drying her hands on a towel. When she saw Maria, her expression tensed, shoulders drawing in like a reflex. "Evening, ma'am," Maria greeted her gently. "Hope you're settling in okay." "I am, thank you." Grace's smile was polite but fragile. Maria took a seat at the table, removing her gloves. "Jake, I'll get straight to it. I got a federal bulletin this morning. There's a man named Eric Dalton, Boston address, mid-30s, 6'1", brown hair, blue eyes. He's wanted for multiple domestic assault charges. Word is, he's been asking around about a missing wife. Claims she's been taken against her will." Jake's face tightened. "You're saying—" "I'm saying I think your house guest might not be as invisible as she hopes." Grace's hands trembled. The towel slipped from her fingers. "He found me?" Maria's voice softened. "Not yet, but he's looking, and he's offering money for information." Jake leaned forward. "How do you know he's talking about her?" Maria reached into her coat and slid a photo across the table, a security still showing Grace and Ranger at the cafe. "This was shared online 2 days ago. Locals might have posted it without thinking. It doesn't take much for a man like that to connect the dots." For a long moment, nobody spoke. The only sound was the ticking clock and Ranger's faint growl. Maria stood, tucking her gloves back into her belt. "I'm not here to scare you. I just want you both to be careful. If you see anyone strange hanging around, call me directly." Grace nodded shakily. "Thank you." Maria gave Jake a steady look. "Walker, you know the law. If she's hiding from an active abuser, you're not just helping someone. You're a witness, and witnesses can become targets." "I'll handle it," Jake said. Maria hesitated, then sighed. "I don't doubt that, but I'd rather you didn't have to." She headed for the door. As the sound of her patrol truck faded, Jake turned to Grace. She was pale, gripping the edge of the table like it was the only solid thing left. That night, after dinner, Jake sat opposite her by the fire. "You need to tell me everything, Grace. No filters, no half-truths." She stared into the flames for a long time before she spoke. "Eric wasn't always a monster," she began softly. "When I met him, he was charming. the kind of man who could make a room stop to listen. My uncle introduced us. He said Eric was successful, dependable. I didn't see the control until it was too late. Her voice wavered as she went on. The first time he demanded her phone. The first time he checked her messages. The first time he hit her and called it an accident. She told Jake how her uncle, greedy for Eric's money, sided with him. How every attempt to leave ended with apologies, flowers, and new bruises. When I finally ran, I had nothing, she said, her eyes glassy. Just a backpack and a bus ticket. The shelter found me 2 days later. Jake listened in silence, jaw clenched. The faint light from the fire cut shadows across his face. They changed my name on the documents, she continued. New ID, new phone, new address. But it's never enough. There's always something. A photo, a payment trail, a friend who posts the wrong thing. She looked up at him. You can't hide from someone who treats control like oxygen. Jake didn't try to comfort her with words. Instead, he reached down and called softly, Ranger. The dog lifted his head, walked over, and lay beside Grace, his weight pressed gently against her legs. She buried her fingers in his fur, the steady rhythm of his breathing grounding her. Jake finally said, You're safe here. I mean it. But if he's coming this way, we'll be ready. Hours later, after Grace had gone to bed, the phone rang. Jake answered immediately. Walker? Jake, it's Maria. Her voice was low, urgent. We need to talk. Dalton's hired someone. Some kind of private tracker. He's asking around in Redwood Falls. Jake's grip on the receiver tightened. How close? Too close. I'll swing by tomorrow, but keep your doors locked tonight. He glanced toward the hallway where Grace slept. Ranger lay near her door, awake, ears pricked. The dog's tail didn't wag this time. Jake whispered into the phone, Understood. When he hung up, the silence of the Montana night felt heavier than usual, thick with the weight of something closing in. The following days turned into a quiet kind of tension. Too quiet. The kind that made every creak in the floorboards sound like a warning. The Montana wind howled through the valley, shaking the shutters, whispering the kind of things only restless souls could hear. Jake Walker moved through his house like a man preparing for something inevitable. He checked every lock, tightened every hinge, and installed new security cameras he'd ordered overnight. The routine gave him something to hold on to, a soldier's habit of turning fear into action. Ranger followed him everywhere, never more than a few feet behind. The German shepherd seemed to sense Jake's unease. His fur bristled when a car passed too close to the property, his amber eyes scanning the horizon as if waiting for an invisible enemy to emerge. Grace tried to keep busy. She baked, tended to the chickens, scrubbed the kitchen counters until they gleamed. But even the small comforts of routine couldn't hide the tremor in her hands when her phone buzzed. She'd changed her number 3 times since arriving. But ghosts, Jake thought, always found a way to dial back. On Wednesday afternoon, Deputy Maria Lopez stopped by. The patrol truck's blue and gold emblem glinted in the sunlight as it pulled into the driveway. Maria climbed out, brushing snow from her uniform jacket. Afternoon, she said, her tone firm but friendly. You two holding up? Jake wiped his hands on a rag and nodded. As well as we can. Maria stepped inside, the warmth of the cabin misting her glasses. Her dark eyes swept across the room, at Grace sitting stiffly by the table, at Ranger lying nearby with his head up, watching her carefully. Maria carried a folder under her arm. I've filed the paperwork for a temporary restraining order. Should keep him from coming near you for now. Grace's voice was barely a whisper. For now? Maria sighed. People like him, control isn't just something they want. It's who they are. A piece of paper might stop him from crossing a line, but not from thinking about it. Jake leaned against the counter, arms folded. So what do we do? Stay alert. Document everything. If he shows up, you call me, not 911. It'll come straight through to my radio. Maria paused, her tone softening. I know you want to protect her, Jake, but don't do anything that'll make you the one in cuffs. Let the law handle it. Jake gave a tight nod. I've fought enough battles with my fists. Maria studied him for a moment. She saw it then, the faint twitch in his jaw, the shadow that crossed his eyes whenever he said too little. PTSD, she thought. She'd seen it before in her brother after Iraq. The way trauma lived just beneath the skin, waiting for an excuse to break through. When she left, Jake stood by the window, watching her patrol car disappear down the dirt road. The silence that followed was heavy. Grace set 2 cups of coffee on the table. She's right, you know, about people like him. Jake turned to her. Yeah, but she's also right about people like me. I don't want to end up on the wrong side of this. Grace looked at him, really looked. His broad shoulders, the small scar near his temple, the exhaustion buried beneath his steady voice. You're not that man, Jake. He didn't answer, just nodded once. But he wasn't sure she was right. That night, the sky cracked open with lightning. The wind picked up, whistling through the pines. Jake couldn't sleep. Ranger lay by the door, ears twitching at every sound. Grace's light was still on in her room. The faint glow slipped through the gap under her door. It was nearly 1 a.m. when Ranger's low growl turned into a sharp bark. Jake was on his feet instantly. What is it, boy? The dog darted to the window, barking louder now. Short, explosive bursts that echoed through the valley. Jake looked outside and froze. Headlights. A dark SUV was parked on the dirt road just beyond the fence, engine idling, its lights cutting through the snow. 2 figures stood by the gate. Jake's pulse quickened. Grace, he called, keeping his voice low. Stay inside. She stepped out of her room, pale and shaking. Is it? Yeah, Jake said, grabbing his jacket. Don't open the door. Whatever happens, stay with Ranger. But Ranger had no intention of staying behind. The moment Jake opened the door, the shepherd slipped through, bounding across the porch, his bark fierce and commanding. The first man in the headlights was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a black wool coat and a smug expression that could curdle blood. His hair was trimmed short, his face clean-shaven but hard, the kind of face that had once convinced people it belonged to a respectable man. Eric Dalton. Beside him stood a smaller man, maybe in his 40s, with a cheap camera hanging from his neck and a cap pulled low. His unshaven face and nervous shifting marked him as hired help, a private investigator, or more likely, a desperate man who took cash without questions. Grace! Eric's voice sliced through the cold air. Grace, it's me. Open the door, honey. We can fix this. Jake stepped forward, calm but deliberate. You're trespassing. Turn around and leave. Eric sneered. You must be the cowboy who thinks he can save her. She's my wife. You're harboring a fugitive. Jake's voice stayed level. She's not your anything. There's a restraining order filed this week. You're violating it by standing here. Don't lecture me about laws, soldier boy, Eric snapped. You think hiding her out here makes you a hero? She's sick. They've filled her head with lies. Ranger stood between them, fur bristling, growl deep and steady. The dog didn't lunge. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to freeze the smaller man in place. "Call him off," Eric barked. Jake didn't move. "Leave my property." The SUV's lights flickered as if to punctuate the standoff. Snow swirled around them, carried by the wind like shards of glass. Then, red and blue lights flashed in the distance. Maria's patrol car roared up the road, siren cutting through the storm. She stepped out, hand on her holster, face set in stone. "Evening, gentlemen," she said, voice sharp enough to draw blood. "Mind telling me what you're doing on private property after midnight?" Eric raised his hands slightly. "Officer, this is a misunderstanding. My wife's inside that house. That man's keeping her from me." Maria's jaw tightened. "Your wife has a restraining order against you. You're violating it, Mr. Dalton. Step back from the gate." "She's brainwashed. You don't know what she's capable of." Maria took one step closer, her boots crunching on the snow. "I know exactly what you're capable of. I've read the hospital reports, the photos. You want to keep pushing this? I'll have you in cuffs before you can finish that sentence." For a moment, Eric's face twisted, rage and fear warring behind his eyes. Then he spat on the ground and took a step back. "This isn't over. I'll take this to federal court if I have to." Maria smiled coldly. "You do that. But you take one more step toward this property tonight, and you're going to see the inside of our county jail instead." Eric turned sharply, storming toward the SUV. The smaller man followed, tripping over his own boots in the snow. The engine roared, tires spinning as the vehicle tore down the road, disappearing into the darkness. Maria holstered her weapon and exhaled. "He'll be back," she muttered. "I know," Jake said quietly, "but so will we." Inside, Grace sat at the kitchen table, hands trembling as she tried to lift a cup of tea. The ceramic rattled against the saucer. Jake knelt beside her. "He's gone for now." Her eyes glistened. "He won't stop, Jake. He never does." Jake took a breath, steady but firm. "Then neither will we. We'll go through the courts, the lawyers, whatever it takes. You don't have to fight him alone anymore." Ranger nudged Grace's leg with his nose, then rested his head in her lap. Her hand trembled as she stroked his fur, but for the first time since the headlights appeared, her breathing slowed. Outside, the wind carried away the last traces of tire tracks. But in Jake's chest, a familiar sensation returned, the steady calm before a storm. Only this time, the war wasn't overseas. It was here, and it had found his doorstep. And for the first time in years, Jake Walker wasn't running from the fight. He was choosing it. The snow that once blanketed the valley had melted into spring mud. The air now filled with the scent of wet earth and pine sap. The world outside Jake Walker's cabin seemed to breathe again. And for the first time in months, Grace Miller could walk the porch without feeling her pulse quicken at every sound. The lawsuit, the threats, the sleepless nights, all of it felt like ghosts fading in the distance, but not yet gone. Deputy Maria Lopez had made good on her promise. One crisp Monday morning she arrived in her county truck, the tires crackling on the gravel driveway. She stepped out holding a thick folder and a cup holder with 3 coffees. Her hair, usually tied tight in a braid, now fell loose around her shoulders, giving her a rare, softer look. She handed Jake his cup first. "Black, no sugar," I remembered. Jake smiled faintly. "Guess I'm predictable." Maria turned to Grace. "I have someone for you to meet. His name's Ben Harper. He's a pro bono attorney out of Billings, handles domestic violence and victims' rights. You'll like him. He's quiet, but sharp. Ben Harper arrived that same afternoon. He was in his early 40s, tall, with thinning sandy hair and rimless glasses that gave him a perpetual look of concentration. His suit was well worn, and his hands bore faint ink stains, a man who'd traded comfort for commitment. His voice, when he spoke, was calm and steady, the kind that made you believe him even before you understood the words. "I've read your file," Ben said to Grace as they sat at the kitchen table. "You've got enough evidence to build a solid case. Hospital records, witness statements, call logs. But I want this to be your voice, not mine. You'll have to tell your story in court." Grace looked at her hands, then at Jake. "I can do that," she said softly, though her voice trembled. Ben smiled, not unkindly. "That's all I needed to hear." The following weeks blurred into paperwork and long phone calls. Maria helped collect old police reports from Boston, and Maggie Barnes from the Horizon Shelter sent sworn statements about the night Grace arrived there. Jake fixed fences, repaired machinery, and pretended to stay busy. But every evening he found himself outside on the porch, staring at the long road leading out of the valley, half expecting headlights that never came. Eric Dalton, meanwhile, had found new weapons. Words. He posted online about being a wronged husband, painting Grace as unstable and Jake as a manipulative veteran who'd brainwashed a fragile woman. The lies spread through small-town gossip and reached even the local paper, which printed a half-truth-laden article about a mysterious rancher and the woman who vanished. Jake read it once, crumpled the paper, and tossed it into the fire. "Let him talk," Grace said, standing behind him. "He's running out of people who'll listen." He looked up at her, the firelight flickering in his eyes. "You're not afraid anymore, are you?" "I am," she admitted, "but I'm not paralyzed by it." The courthouse in Billings was an old sandstone building with tall windows and too many echoes. Grace sat in the front row beside Ben, hands clasped together. Jake sat directly behind her, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. Ranger lay under his seat, his great head resting on his paws, eyes fixed forward like a silent guard. Eric arrived in a dark navy suit, clean-shaven, hair slicked back, the picture of composure. His lawyer, a gray-haired man named Richard Collins, whispered something in his ear just before the hearing began. Eric's charm was back on full display, the smile, the practiced sorrow. But his eyes betrayed him, cold, calculating, hungry for control. When it was her turn to speak, Grace stood. The courtroom seemed to shrink around her. Her voice wavered at first but steadied as she began describing the years of control, the nights of fear, the lies and bruises hidden beneath makeup and long sleeves. She didn't cry, she didn't tremble. Her voice grew stronger, like she was reclaiming something stolen. Behind her, Jake's fists clenched, not in anger, but in pride. Ranger shifted, sensing the tension in his owner's heartbeat. Ben ended her testimony with a single question. "Ms. Miller, what do you want now?" Grace looked at the judge. "I want to stop running." When the verdict came, it was clear. The restraining order became permanent. Eric's lawsuit was dismissed. His request for spousal assets was denied. For the first time, the law didn't just protect Grace, it freed her. Outside the courthouse, the sky was a brilliant blue. Ben shook her hand firmly. "You did it. You spoke truth to a man who never thought you would." Maria grinned. "And you made a courtroom full of people listen." Jake didn't say anything. He just placed his hand gently on Grace's shoulder. That was enough. Summer returned to Montana, soft and golden. Life at the ranch found its rhythm again. Grace tended the garden, Jake repaired the barn roof, and Ranger spent his days stretched out in the grass, occasionally chasing the wind like an old soldier reliving glory days. Maria stopped by every few weeks, always bringing donuts and gossip from town. Ben sent postcards from new cases, his cramped handwriting barely legible but always signed, "Keep going." Grace had started writing again. Journals, letters she never sent, small essays she hoped might one day help other women like her. Jake would find her on the porch, notebook on her lap, hair loose and sunlit, and think how strange it was that peace could look like this. One afternoon in early autumn, as the wheat fields turned gold, Grace sat beside him on the porch steps. Ranger slept nearby, his ears twitching in dreams. "I've been thinking," she said. "That usually means trouble," he teased. She smiled. "Not this time. I don't want to just stay here as a guest anymore. This place, this life, it feels like home. I want to stay, if you want me to." Jake was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at hers, his expression soft, unguarded in a way she'd never seen before. "Grace, you've been home since the day you walked off that plane. Ranger and I just didn't know how to say it out loud." Her eyes shimmered. "So that's a yes?" He chuckled. "That's a forever." She leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder. The fields stretched endlessly ahead, golden under the dying sun. Years passed quietly. The ranch grew, and so did the family. In the front yard, a little girl, barefoot, wild-haired, with Jake's eyes and Grace's laugh, chased Ranger around the oak tree, squealing with delight. The shepherd, now gray around the muzzle, barked playfully, pretending to lose. From the porch, Grace watched, her hand resting on the gentle curve of her stomach. Jake sat beside her, coffee mug in hand, his beard now touched with silver. "You're not alone now," he said softly, the same words that once began everything. Grace turned to him, smiling. "None of us are." The Montana wind swept through the valley again, carrying the laughter of a child, the echo of a promise kept, and perhaps something else. The faint sound of an engine in the distance, far down the road. Jake's eyes flicked toward the horizon, then back to Grace. He smiled, but his hand reached down to pat Ranger's head, a habit he hadn't quite unlearned. The dog lifted his ears, alert but calm. The breeze shifted, and the sound faded. Life went on. But in the silence between heartbeats, the question lingered. Was peace ever permanent? Or just the quiet between storms? The sun dipped below the ridge, and the screen door creaked shut behind them.